The gentleman's time has expired. We will now proceed to the first round of questions.
Point of order.
Gentleman will state his point of order.
We've been told that counsel for the Democrats was a witness, and that's why he didn't have to comport with the rules of decorum. And now he's sitting up here.
Gentleman will state a point of order.
I've been a judge, and I know that you don't get to be a witness and a judge in the same case. That's my point of order. He should not be up here.
It's not a point of order. We will, pursuant to House Resolution 660 and its accompanying Judiciary Committee procedures, there will be 45 minutes of questions conducted by the chairman or majority counsel, followed by 45 minutes by the ranking member or minority counsel. Only the chair and ranking member and their respective counsels may question witnesses during this period. Following that, unless I specify additional equal time for extended questioning, we will proceed under the 5-minute rule, and every member will have the chance to ask questions. I now recognize myself for the first round of questions. The Republicans' expert witness last week, Professor Turley, wrote in an article that, quote, "There is no question that the use of public office for personal gain is an impeachable offense, including the withholding of military aid in exchange for the investigation of a political opponent. You just have to prove it happened," close quote. That was Mr. Turley's comment. Now, Mr. Goldman, did the investigative committees conclude that the evidence proved that the president used his public office for personal gain?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
And in fact, finding of fact 5 said President Trump used the power of the office of the president to apply increasing pressure on the president of Ukraine and the Ukrainian government to announce the politically motivated investigations desired by President Trump. And did the evidence also prove that President Trump withheld military aid in exchange for an announcement of an investigation of his political opponent?
Yes, it did.
And in fact, finding of fact 5B said, quote, President Trump, acting through his agents and subordinates, conditioned release of the vital military assistance he had suspended to Ukraine on the President of Ukraine's public announcement of the investigations that President Trump sought. And did the evidence demonstrate that President Trump undermined the national security interests of the United States?
Yes, in several ways.
And finding of fact 6 said, in directing and orchestrating this scheme to advance his personal political interests, President Trump did not implement, promote, or advance U.S. anti-corruption policies. In fact, the president sought to pressure and induce the government of Ukraine to announce politically motivated investigations, lacking legitimate predication that the U.S. government otherwise discourages and opposes as a matter of policy in that country and around the world. In so doing, the president undermined U.S. policy supporting anti-corruption reform and the rule of law in Ukraine and undermined U.S. national security. And did the evidence also show that President Trump compromised the national security of the United States?
Yes.
In fact, finding of fact 7 said, by withholding vital military assistance and diplomatic support from a strategic foreign partner government engaged in an ongoing military conflict illegally instigated by Russia, President Trump compromised national security to advance his personal political interests. And did the evidence prove that President Trump engaged in a scheme to cover up his conduct and obstruct congressional investigators?
Yes, right from the outset.
And in fact, finding of fact 9 says, using the power of the office of the president and exercising his authority over the executive branch, President Trump ordered and implemented a campaign to conceal his conduct from the public and frustrate and obstruct the House of Representatives impeachment inquiry. Finally, the constitutional scholars from our hearing last week testified that the president's conduct toward Ukraine and pattern of inviting foreign election interference was a continuing risk to our free and fair elections. Did the evidence prove that President Trump was a threat to our elections?
Yes, it did, Mr. Chairman.
And in fact, finding of fact 8 says, faced with the revelation of his actions, President Trump publicly and repeatedly persisted in urging foreign governments, including Ukraine and China, to investigate his political opponent. This continued solicitation of foreign interference in a U.S. election presents a clear and present danger that the president will continue to use the power of his office for his personal political gain, close quote, I would add, in the next election. I now yield to my counsel, Mr. Berke, for additional questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Castor, as an experienced investigator, would you agree that it's relevant to look at evidence bearing on the president's state of mind that may help explain the president's actions?
I think the evidence that we talked about show.
Microphone.
Use your mic, please.
Sir, my only
Sorry, that's
question
okay.
to you is that a relevant thing to consider?
Right, like the call he had with Senator Johnson.
It's relevant to consider. Sir, would you agree that Joe Biden was a leading Democratic contender to face President Trump in 2020?
I wouldn't agree with that.
You disagree with it. So, sir, it's your testimony
It's too early.
that President Trump did not view President Biden to be a legitimate contender.
I don't
Is that
know what
correct?
President Trump believed or didn't believe, but it's too early.
Sir, as part of your inquiry, did you determine whether President Trump tweeted at all about former Vice President Joe Biden between January and July 25th, and how many times?
I didn't look at Twitter. I try to stay off Twitter lately.
Did you know President Trump tweeted about former Vice President Joe Biden over 25 times between January and July 25th?
No, I didn't look at those tweets.
Did you look at how many times President Trump mentioned Vice President Biden in a speech or rally leading up to the July 25th call?
Hey, President Trump goes to a lot of rallies. He does a lot of tweeting. I think it's pretty difficult to draw too many conclusions from his tweets or his statements at rallies.
Mr. Chairman.
Well, sir,
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman is not recognized for parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. Chairman, what is
The gentleman is not recognized. The gentleman, Mr. Berke, has the time.
We're going to ignore the rules
We are
and
not-
allow witnesses to ask the questions, then
Gentlemen will
how many
suspend.
other rules are you just going to disregard?
Gentlemen will suspend. Parliamentary inquiries are not in order at this time.
Well, how about a
Point of
point of
order.
order?
Point of order.
This is not appropriate to have a witness
have a point of
be a
order?
questioner
I have a point
of
of order, Mr.
somebody
Chairman.
that was a witness
Gentlemen-
when he was.
The gentleman will suspend.
It's just wrong.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman will
Mr.
refrain
Chairman,
from
point of
making.
inquiry.
The gentleman will.
Well, I made a point of order and you won't rule on it.
I have not heard a point of order. If the gentleman has a stated point.
Mr. Chairman, point of
Gentleman
order.
has a point of order. He will state your point of order.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
There is no rule nor precedent for anybody being a witness and then getting
is
to
not a
come up
point of
and
order.
question. And so
I have ruled that-
we would, the
is
point
not-
of order is he's inappropriate to be up here asking questions.
That is not a point of order. He's here in accordance with Rule 66 with
How
President.
much money do you have to give to get to do that?
The gentleman will not cast aspersions on members of staff of the committee. The gentleman.
Mr. Chairman.
It was a legitimate order.
Mr. Berke has the time.
Mr. Chairman, point of
Berke
order.
has-
Is Mr. Berke a member of the committee?
Mr. Berke has the time.
Mr.
Mr.
Chairman,
Chairman,
I have a legitimate
Mr.
point
Berke-
of order.
Point of order.
Mr. Berke has the time.
You have to recognize point of
Point of
order.
order.
Point of order. The gentleman will state a point of order.
This gentleman is presenting his opinions as a witness. He's supposed to present the material
Gentleman will
facts in
state
the
a point of
report,
order.
not to appear for his opinions. Is that right or not?
The gentleman, that is not a point of order. It is Mr. Berke's time pursuant to
It's
Rule 66.
inappropriate testimony
pursuant
to the committee.
It is, I have ruled, the gentleman has the time pursuant to
Chairman,
Rule 660.
Point of order, Mr.
The
Chairman.
gentleman will state a point of
Just to
order.
help
Yes,
you, that's
yes,
not
my
Rule
point-
660.
The gentleman will state a point of order, if he has one.
Yes, the point of order is this. We operate by rules. If there's nothing specifically in the rule permitting this, we go by precedent. It is unprecedented for a person to come and sit who you've described as a witness to then return to the bench and begin
The gentleman
questioning.
has stated-
That is a point of order.
The gentleman has stated, is that a point of order? Yes. That is not a point of order, but I will point out, it's not a cognizable point of order. I will point out that the gentleman has been designated by me to do this questioning pursuant to Rule 660, House Resolution 660, which is part of the rules of the House.
Why didn't you do a soliloquy then?
It is in accordance with the rules of the House, and the gentleman's time will resume. Mr. Berke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Castor, you are aware that President Trump announced his candidacy for re-election in 2020, and he announced it the month before the July 25th call on June 21st?
Okay.
Did you find that? Did you look at that in your investigation as part of looking at President Trump's intent and what he intended on the July 25th call?
I mean, the date he announced his, he's obviously running for re-election. What is the date he announced his intent to run for re-election matter?
And, sir, you knew that President Biden had already announced his intent to run in April of that year, too, correct?
It's been related to me. I'm I don't know when Vice President Biden indicated he was going to run as I sit here today.
So you would agree with me that if the Ukraine announced a corruption investigation of former Vice President Joe Biden, that would hurt his credibility as a candidate. Would you agree with that basic principle, sir?
Well, nobody,
Yes or no, sir? Would you agree with that principle?
well, I slightly disagree with the predicate, with the premise of your question, because
Chairman,
we're talking about
I
Hunter
object to the
Biden.
question that requests opinion evidence.
The gentleman
rather
is
than
not
fact.
recognized. The gentleman has the floor.
Well, I object to the question.
gentleman-
Rule on whether the question's in order or not.
The question is in order. The gentleman will continue.
Why?
The gentleman will continue. It's his time.
Let's get back to the fact that we're talking about 8 ambiguous lines in a call transcript. The president was not asking for a personal favor. He was speaking on behalf of the American people. He said, and I'll read it, I'd like you to find out what happened with the whole situation in Ukraine. They say crowd strike. I guess you have one of your wealthy people.
Sir, I'm not asking you to read that. Let me. If you want to talk about the transcript, I want to talk to you about some addition. You said it's 8 lines. Let's look at slide 3, if we may. The reference to Biden. Sir, you see, on the July 25th call on page 4, isn't it the fact that President Trump, in his call with President Zelensky, said that he heard that former Vice President Joe Biden had stopped the prosecution of his son? Is that correct, sir? Yes or no?
It says the other thing. There's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution.
Well, that is correct. He said he stopped the prosecution.
Point of order, he's entitled to answer the question fully, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman
Have you seen that
not recognized.
there's a video of the former VP? I think that's what the president's referring to. He was at the Council on Foreign Relations, and it was a little bit of a, the former VP was a little bit audacious in how he described. He went over to the.
I'm only asking you what it says on the transcript. Is that what it says, sir?
It says the other thing. There's a lot of talk about Biden's son.
And that Biden stopped the prosecution. It says that, correct?
That's what it says here. Yes.
And then it also says, it goes on to say, President Trump asked President Zelensky if you can look into it, correct? Is that the words? If you can look into it, correct?
That's what it says. And then he says,
So President Trump, am I right? President Trump was asking Ukrainian President Zelensky to have the Ukrainian officials look into Vice President Joe Biden, correct? Is that correct, yes or no?
I don't think the record supports that.
It doesn't say, can you look into it? President Trump is not asking him to say that?
I don't think it supports that. I think it's ambiguous.
Mr. Goldman, you're an experienced federal prosecutor. I know that firsthand. Is this President Trump asking President Zelensky to investigate his political rival, Joe Biden?
I don't think there's any other way to read the words on the page than to conclude that.
And Mr. Castor, you made a point. Well, let me ask you a question. As an experienced investigator, is it your experience that when someone has done something wrongful or corrupt and they're dealing with somebody who's not in the scheme, that they state their intentions to do something wrongful and corrupt? Is that your experience as an investigator?
Well, I mean, are you talking about the call transcript?
I'm just asking you in general.
General?
In general.
You're saying that the schemer
Yes.
would talk about his scheme?
Would he generally admit that he was doing something wrongful and corrupt to someone not in the scheme?
No.
In fact, you made a big point, sir, in your presentation, that on that call, President Trump did not go further and tell President Zelensky that he wanted the investigation announced to help his 2020 election.
He definitely did not talk about 2020.
Yeah. And Mr. Goldman, would you agree that if President Trump was acting corruptly, wrongfully, abusing his power, that it was unlikely he was going to confess to President Zelensky that he was asking for the investigation explicitly to help his 2020 election prospects?
Yeah, in my experience as 10 years as a prosecutor, you almost never have a defendant or someone who's engaging in misconduct who would ever explicitly say, in this case, President Zelensky, I'm going to bribe you now, or I'm going to ask for a bribe, or I am now going to extort you. That's not the way these things work.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. And Mr. Castor, getting back to you, you said that he said about Hunter Biden and talked about it. Hunter Biden had been on the board of Burisma going back to 2014, correct?
Yes.
President Trump supported Ukraine with aid and otherwise in both 2017 and 2018, correct?
Yeah, President Trump has done a lot for Ukraine.
That's not, yes. And, sir, but isn't it correct that President Trump did not raise anything about Hunter Biden and his father, Vice President Joe Biden, in 2017 or 2018? He only did it the year before his election in 2020 when both he and Vice President Joe Biden were leading candidates. Isn't that true, sir?
I think what happened is the president saw this video of the former VP, and I think it coalesced in his mind.
Sir, please answer my question. He didn't raise any of these issues in 2017 or 2018.
I don't know that he did or he didn't. I mean, that is not something that we've looked at.
You have no evidence that he did, did you?
No, but I have no evidence he did not. I mean, this video is pretty
All right, sir, let me ask you this. You talked about Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who was a highly decorated Purple Heart recipient and worked in the Trump administration, correct?
Yes, sir.
He had a reaction to the call, didn't he?
He did.
He was listening to it, correct?
He did. He was.
Let's look at his reaction. He said, I immediately went to John Eisenberg, the lead legal counsel. He said, it is improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen and a political opponent. That was his testimony, correct? Yes or no? That was his testimony. Yes?
Yeah.
Yes. And let me ask you this, sir. You had said that the Intelligence Committee majority report that Mr. Goldman had talked about, you said it presents as if things are clear, but they're not clear. Is that what you said, sir?
That's absolutely correct.
And you also worked on, personally, you said worked on the minority report, correct?
Yep. Yes, sir.
Was it important to you to be accurate in the minority report that you worked on? Was it important to be fair to witnesses, to be accurate about what they said?
Of course.
Was it important to be fair to the American people?
Of course.
To accurately report what people said?
Of course.
Well, let me ask you about somebody else on that call. Let me ask you about Jennifer Williams. Now, she was a special advisor to Vice President Pence on Europe and Russia affairs. Is that correct?
Yes.
She worked for Vice President Pence, correct?
Correct.
And you said in your opening statement that these accusations that President Trump was trying to do something for a political purpose, that was made by people who were had predetermined motives for impeachment. Isn't that correct?
Some of them might, but I also indicated that some of the witnesses in the impeachment inquiry, I think, have revised their views after the call transcript came out and the whistleblower complaint was released.
Are you calling Vice President Pence's special advisor a liar, sir?
No, I didn't say that.
Are you saying she was predetermined to impeach?
I didn't say that. But you know what, the question about Jennifer Williams is interesting is...
I didn't ask you, sir.
She never mentioned anything to her supervisor. She never mentioned anything to anybody in the vice president's office. En route to Warsaw, when the vice president was going to meet with President Zelensky, she didn't even raise it as a potential issue that might, catch the vice president off guard.
Well, Mr.
So
Castor,
her concern that she articulated during the course of the deposition and during the course of the hearing was incongruent with the facts and what she did during times relevant.
Mr. Castor, let's look at your report, what you wrote in the report about Ms. Williams. So if we could put up slide 6, please. And sir, you made the same point that you tried to make to discount her testimony. You said she testified that although she found the call to be unusual, she did not raise concerns to her supervisor.
Right. Nobody in America knew about Jennifer Williams's concerns until she walked in the door for her deposition.
Sir, when you said that although she found the call to be unusual, that wasn't accurate. That's not what she said about the call. She didn't say it was just unusual, did she?
She said it was unusual.
That's not all she said about it, was it?
Okay, I mean, she was here for 9 hours in the bunker, so she said a lot about the call.
Sir, that was you in the minority.
Mr. Chairman, can we get a copy of the slide deck? We can't see. I just want to see.
The gentleman will suspend. The gentleman has the time.
But we can't see the stuff. Can we just get a copy?
The gentleman has the time.
I'm happy to read it. Jennifer Williams testified that, quote, although she found the call to be unusual, quote, she did not, end of quote, she did not raise concerns to her supervisor. Isn't it a fact, sir, that Ms. Williams said a lot more than that?
Mr. Chairman, I have a point of order.
Gentleman will state his point of order. The clock
Point of
will stop.
order is the gentleman from Florida has complained that he can't see what the questioner is relying on and would like to see it. And
That is not a cognizable point of order, and it was read to him. The gentleman will proceed.
only half of it was read to him.
Irrelevant.
Now, let's slow down a bit here. Let's slow down a bit here so that members are able to fully see what is being put in support of what you're trying to do. We can't do that without being able to see it or read it. Mr. Gates has said that. Now, let's slow down so that we can see or hear what he is referring to. And you're not letting that happen. And that goes to the privileges of the members
Mr. Chairman,
that
it's
you
never-
are
Mr.
asking
Chairman,
to
it's never-
sit in on this meeting and to vote.
The gentleman will suspend the.
Mr. Chairman, I can see now. I appreciate the accommodation. It's, well, the monitor was turned. Now we can see. Thank
Okay.
you.
The gentleman will resume.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in here it says that you said Ms. Williams said that she found it to be, quote, unusual and nothing more. Let's look at slide 7 if we may.
Nothing more.
Let's look at, it says unusual, correct? Isn't
Right,
a
but it
fact-
doesn't say and nothing more.
No, it says unusual. Isn't it a fact, sir, that what Ms. Williams says is it struck her as unusual and inappropriate? Isn't that correct, sir?
Okay,
That's what she said in her testimony.
okay.
And in your staff report, you left out the inappropriate part,
It
didn't
wasn't
you?
a block quote. It was, she felt it was unusual. She didn't raise the concerns to Lieutenant General Kellogg.
So, sir, let me ask you, were you as fair to the American people in describing what Ms. Williams said as you were in describing everything else in your report?
I don't have an issue with the way we described Ms. Williams' testimony.
Well, let's look at what else Ms. Williams said. Can we put up slide 8? This is from Ms. Williams' public testimony at 34. She said, quote, I thought that the references to specific individuals in investigations such as former Vice President Biden and his son struck me as political in nature, given that former Vice President is a political opponent of the President. So you left that out of your staff report too, didn't you?
You know, Ms. Williams,
Sir, did you leave that out of your report, yes or no?
if you're telling me I did, I mean, I don't know as I sit here right now whether that's in the
I'm
report.
telling you, you did.
Okay.
And do you have an explanation, sir, where you said Ms. Williams said that the call was unusual when she said it was unusual and inappropriate and of a political nature because it raised the Vice President who she recognized was a political opponent of the President.
Her views of the call differ remarkably from Mr. Morrison, also from Lieutenant General Kellogg.
That's not my question. My question is, why did you misquote Ms. Williams in terms of what she said?
misquote
Why
her.
did you do it?
We certainly didn't misquote her.
So from the standard that you apply to your fact-finding in your report, you believe that it was entirely proper to say that Ms. Williams found the call to be unusual, when in fact she found the call to be unusual and inappropriate and of a political nature, given that the former Vice President is a political opponent of the President. Is that your testimony, sir?
I mean, we described what Ms. Williams said.
Sir,
She
is
said
that
it was
your testimony?
inappropriate.
No, you didn't.
Mr. Chairman, if either you can ask or you can answer. Mr. Chairman, I'm not. He can either ask or answer. He can't do both. Mayor, you can ask or answer. You can't do both.
Gentleman is not recognized.
The chairman-
has
Mr.
the
Chairman,
time.
I make
allow
a
him to
point
speak.
of order that
Gentleman
he's
has the time.
badgering the witness.
He is not. The gentleman will continue.
And sir, you invoked Mr.
Mr.
Moore.
Chairman, can you rule on my point of order that he's badgering the witness because he's doing that?
Sir, you invoked Mr.
That is not a cognizable motion. It does not call for a ruling, and the time belongs to the gentleman.
A point of order, the committee is not in order, and the chairman is not in order.
That is not a point of order. The committee is in order.
Well, would you rule on my original point of order?
The original point of order was not cognizable and does not necessitate a ruling.
That the
Chairman,
lawyer is badgering the witness? We have to have some
Chairman,
decorum in here, and you have your rules of decorum, which aren't comporting with everybody else's rules of decorum.
I will say that sharp cross-examination of a witness is not badgering the witness. The gentleman will continue.
Mr. Chairman.
It is if it's
Gentleman
by
will
another
continue.
witness.
No one, the gentleman has the time.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Gentleman will state a point of order.
Under Resolution 660, we're supposed to follow the federal rules of evidence. Is that right? No. What is it?
No, it is not correct.
What are the rules? What are the objections that we're able to make?
That is not a point of order.
It is a point of order. There's no rules.
It is not a point of order. The gentleman will continue.
Where's the list of rules?
The gentleman will continue.
Thank
Are we
you,
allowed
thank
to
you,
object
Mr.
to
Chairman.
anything, then?
The gentleman will continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Castor, you just invoked Tim Morrison. He was someone on the call too, correct?
Yep.
And let me put up slide 9 of Mr. Morrison's testimony on page 38 of his public testimony. And Mr. Morrison said, well, the question by Mr. Goldman. You heard the call. You recognized that President Trump was not discussing the talking points that the NSC had prepared based on official U.S. policy and was instead talking about the investigations that Fiona Hill had warned you about. And then you reported it immediately to the NSC legal advisor. Is that the correct claim of events here? And Mr. Morrison said, that's correct. Before I ask you, Mr. Castor, let me ask you, Mr. Goldman. Earlier, before your presentation, we showed a testimony of Ms. Hill where she referred to what President Trump was trying to do as running a domestic political errand. Is that what you understand? Is that what you intended to ask Mr. Morrison about in your question to him?
Yes, it was about these two specific investigations that President Trump ultimately did discuss and ask President Zelensky to do. These are the same two investigations that were discussed and were the only two investigations that were at issue throughout the entirety of the scheme. And so what our evidence found was that any time there was a reference to investigations, it referenced the Biden investigation and the 2016 election investigation. And in fact, Ambassador Volker actually said that whenever he was using the term corruption, what he meant was those specific two investigations.
And what was the significance to you that Mr. Morrison, who Mr. Castor himself has relied on and invoked twice today, where he said that he understood these were the investigations that Fiona Hill had warned him about? What did you understand that to mean?
When Dr. Hill left and Tim Morrison replaced her, they had transition meetings. And during one of those transition meetings, Dr. Hill told Tim Morrison about what she believed to be this irregular channel that Ambassador Sondland was operating, where they were pushing for Ukraine to do these investigations. And Dr. Hill in particular was very concerned because, as she said, as you pointed out, that was a domestic political errand, and what she was working on and the National Security Council was working on related to national security and foreign policy, and those were two entirely separate things.
And was she expressing the view that President Trump had chose his own personal political interests over the foreign policy positions that Ms. Hill was trying to pursue?
At the time that she said that to Tim Morrison, she was not aware of whether President Trump had actually endorsed these investigations, but she did testify that after she read the call transcript, which she only read after it was released like the rest of us, she said that she put 2 and 2 together and realized that that is exactly what he was talking about.
And what was 2 and 2 again?
It equals 4.
And what is 4 in this investigation, sir?
Well, it was used by 2 witnesses, Ambassador Sondland and David Holmes, as the only logical conclusion to explain why the security assistance was being withheld from Ukraine. And based on all of the various factors and their direct involvement in issues related to Ukraine, they concluded that the security assistance was being withheld to put pressure and as a condition on the initiation of the 2 investigations that are referenced here.
Yep. Turning to you, Mr.
I got to clear a couple things up here, though. I got to clear a couple things up here, if I may. First of all, Morrison was concerned. Morrison didn't think the call was.
Sir, there's no question.
The gentleman has the time, not the witness.
I mean,
sir,
Morrison was concerned about leaks.
Sir, let me ask you, sir. Sir, you said
By the way, Volker never meant.
The gentleman has the time. The clock will stop if he's interrupted.
Will this witness be able to cross-examine Mr. Berke like he's being able to cross-examine the opposing witness? That's a point of inquiry.
Will not shout out in the middle of testimony.
You need to call balls and strikes the right way. You don't interrupt either one of them, Mr. Chairman. You're questioner or the witness. Bang it harder. It still doesn't make the point that you're not doing it right.
The gentleman will continue.
Sir, I believe it was your testimony, as I wrote it down. The Democrats are about blocking info when they should be seeking information.
Oh, my goodness. That is absolutely right.
Okay. And then you said that the Trump administration has in fact cooperated and facilitated congressional oversight investigations. Is that correct, sir? Am I just, yes or no? Is that correct?
Absolutely. The Trump administration has participated in oversight during the entire Congress until it got to this impeachment inquiry.
So let me ask you about this call, sir. Robert Blair.
The terms are just not fair.
Robert Blair, who was on this call, the Trump administration, the president himself directed him not to appear and give testimony, correct?
Robert Blair, I'm glad you brought
No,
him
I'm
up
asking you, did the president direct him not to appear and give testimony, yes or no?
I think he was allowed to come if agency counsel.
He was not allowed to come under the terms set by the House Intelligence Committee, correct?
I think he would have come with agency counsel.
The Trump administration directed him not to come, correct?
He would have provided testimony, I think, if agency counsel could have come. I mean, it's really expensive to hire these outside lawyers.
John Eisenberg was directed not to come, correct? The lawyer.
Eisenberg presents another set of
But he was directed not to come. The lawyer who Lieutenant Colonel Vindman went to, correct?
Okay, Eisenberg is he may have been able to come with agency counsel, but he presents some complexities. I mean, he's the chief legal advisor for Ambassador Bolton.
So he was directed not to come, correct?
He may have been able to come with agency counsel, but his testimony does present complexities.
Sir, let me ask you this. Was it U.S. policy on July 26 to request that Ukraine investigate former Vice President Joe Biden?
You know, I think you're reading a little too much into, some of the 8 lines. I don't think the president was requesting an investigation into Joe Biden. He just mentions an offhand comment.
Sir, is that a no? It was not U.S. policy to look into Joe Biden?
Yeah, but you're presuming that it then at some point became U.S. policy to investigate Joe Biden, and I don't think that's the case.
Sir, let me show you what slide 10, testimony of, again, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. And he was asked, are you aware of any written product from the National Security Council suggesting that investigations in the 2020 election, the Bidens or Burisma, are part of the official policy of the United States? No, I'm not. Now let me go also to Tim Morrison, who you invoked. If we could go to slide 11. Mr. Morrison was asked by our own Congressman Swalwell, who was also on the Intelligence Committee, and said, just going to pick up in the middle of that long question, it said, you listened to the one call that you listened to between the President of the United States and the President of Ukraine. The President of the United States priorities were to investigate the Bidens. And I'm asking you, sir, why didn't you follow up on the President's priorities when you talked to the Ukrainians? Mr. Morrison said, sir, I did not understand it as a policy objective. Mr. Goldman, let me ask you, there was a package prepared before that call of what President Trump was supposed to talk about with President Zelensky, correct?
Yes.
And am I correct, sir, that one of the things that he was supposed to talk about, and was in his prepared remarks, was the anti-corruption platform of President Zelensky that he ran and won on, correct?
Yes, the witnesses testified that that is a consistent and persistent policy objective for the United States.
Did President Trump mention corruption once in his call with Mr. Zelensky?
No, he did not.
Did he mention looking into anything other than the 2 investigations that were politically helpful to him, the 2016 election investigation and the investigation of his political rival, former Vice President Joe Biden?
No, he did not.
May I
Mr. Castor,
add something there?
No, you can't. Mr. Castor, let me ask you a question.
President Trump did mention.
Are you going to let him answer?
He did mention that there's some very bad people there.
You can yell.
The gentleman the time is the questioners, and he can ask the questions of whoever he wants. And when you question, you'll have the same rules.
And Mr. Castor, in fairness, you'll be able to answer questions asked by minority counsel when it's their turn.
Okay, but
I have 45 minutes, so let me ask you.
Come on, Barry. In fairness here, President Trump talks about very bad people.
Mr. Castor, if I can finish? And that was, let me finish, sir. Let me ask you this, sir. Sir, there were 2 lawyers mentioned on the call. We've heard testimony already. Mr. Trump said to President Trump said to President Zelensky that he should speak to 2 people. His personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and the Attorney General Barr, correct?
Yep.
Okay. Immediately after this call memorandum was released, isn't it the case that Attorney General Barr and the Department of Justice issued a statement about his role in all this?
He did.
let's put up the statement. Slide 13, please. The Department of Justice. The President has not spoken with the Attorney General about having Ukraine investigate anything relating to former Vice President Biden or his son. The President has not asked the Attorney General to contact Ukraine on this or any other matter. The Attorney General has not communicated with Ukraine on this or any other subject. So, Mr. Goldman, is it fair to say that the Attorney General didn't want anything to do with these investigations that President Trump had raised with President Zelensky on the call?
I think it goes actually even a little further. I think whether the Attorney General wanted anything to do or not is in addition to the fact that the Attorney General said he had nothing to do with Ukraine, and in fact that there were no ongoing investigations at the time of this call or in August. And that became an issue in the investigation. There is a formal channel that the Department of Justice has and the United States government has to obtain evidence related to an ongoing investigation. And that is generally the proper way to engage a foreign country through treaties to get information. But several of the witnesses testified that they looked into that at the urging of the Ukrainians, and they determined that there was no formal ongoing investigation nor any formal request on these topics.
Now, the other lawyer on the call, Rudy Giuliani, he was more than happy to continue to be involved in trying to get Ukraine to investigate President Trump's political rival, Joe Biden, correct?
Mr. Giuliani was very active and involved in pushing for these investigations for several months before the July 25th call, and then for several months after, including apparently 3 days ago.
And sir, Mr. Castor, you would agree, you wrote in your report that Rudy Giuliani, that the Ukrainians themselves knew that Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer, was a conduit to convince President Trump that President Zelensky was a serious reformer, correct?
Well, the Ukrainians knew that.
That's what he said.
Sir, isn't that what you said in your report?
Rudy had the president's ear.
And he was a conduit. Let me put up slide 14, if I may, and we actually have your report here. And it says the Ukrainians knew that he, meaning Rudy Giuliani, was a conduit to convince President Trump that President Zelensky was serious about reform. Isn't that what you wrote in your report, sir? Okay. And in fact, during the call, President Trump asked President Zelensky to speak directly to his personal lawyer about Ukrainian matters that President Trump was interested in, correct?
You referred him to Rudy, yeah.
Yes. And in fact, President Zelensky said, oh, we already knew that, and he's been in touch with my aides, correct?
That's right. In fact, I mean, the Ukrainians are the ones that President Zelensky is the one who first brings up Mr. Giuliani on the call.
Right, because they knew that Mr. Giuliani was a conduit to the president, and if they made Mr. Giuliani happy, they'd make the President Trump happy.
Ambassador Volker testified, though, that Mr. Giuliani had a negative impression of Ukraine and that he was possibly fueling the president's views. And so they had, there were some discussions about, hey, if you can convince Rudy that President Zelensky is a true reformer, the real deal, that would be a beneficial link.
Well, sir, you agree that President Giuliani, before the July 25th call and after, was pushing for the Ukrainians to investigate former Vice President Joe Biden. Isn't that correct? Yes or no?
Yeah, I mean, the record is somewhat spotty with Giuliani. I mean, I know the New York Times reported in May, but Ambassador Volker gave a pretty detailed account of his meeting on July 19th.
Well, let's take a look. If we could put up slide 16, the New York Times article you referred to.
Yeah.
Right, and the article says, I'll read it. Mr. Giuliani, and this is dated May 9th, 2019, before the call, Mr. Giuliani said he plans to travel to Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, in the coming days and wants to meet with the nation's president-elect to urge him to pursue inquiries that, and then it continues, that allies of the White House contend could yield new information about two matters of intense interest to Mr. Trump. One is the origin of the special counsel's investigation, goes on to describe it. New sentence. The other is the involvement of former Vice President Joe Biden's son. Okay, and now that was in the New York Times article. And
Can we talk about the breakfast with Volker?
If we could, not yet. If we could continue the rest of the article to the next slide, which is slide 17. This is the same article. And Mr. Giuliani was very explicit when he was interviewed. He said, and this isn't foreign policy. I'm now quoting the words that are highlighted. It says, it'll be very, very helpful to my client. My only client is the President of the United States. He's the one I have an obligation to report to him what happened regarding the Ukraine. Now, sir, were you aware on that same day Mr. Giuliani gave an interview about what he intended to do? And let's go to slide 18. This is from Real Clear Politics, and it should be on the screen in front of you as well. And what Mr. Giuliani said about the Ukraine, he said, it's a big story, it's a dramatic story, and I guarantee you Joe Biden will not get to Election Day without this being investigated. Not because I want to see him investigated, the collateral to what I was doing. So, sir, and you agree, Election Day refers to the 2020 election where President Trump will be running for re-election, correct?
I don't know what Giuliani was talking about, but I guess you're right.
Okay, well, so that was my only question to you. You'll have a chance to answer questions to the minority counsel. Now, and President Trump, let me show you slide 19.
We're going to sidestep the Volker meeting on July 19th?
Sure, you'll have an opportunity to talk about that when minority counsel questions you. Let me go to slide 19, please. And the president says he's being interviewed now the same day in a Politico, and he's asked about Mr. Giuliani. He's leaving soon, I think in the next couple days. Mr. Trump says, I see. Well, I will speak to him about it before he leaves. Now, let me go to slide 20, because President, in this one, it's actually a tweet that he put out on June 21st, 2019, roughly a month before the call. He says, new president of Ukraine, still silent on investigation of Ukrainian interference in 2016 election and alleged Biden bribery of the prior president. And again, sir, as you said, the Ukrainians knew that Mr. Giuliani had the ear of his client, President Trump. Isn't that correct, sir? Is that correct, sir? Yes or no?
Giuliani was doing some things out here, and then he became involved with the official channel, with Volker, with Sondland, and at that meeting on July 19th, Volker, counseled against the perspective Giuliani was taking.
So my question to you, sir, is this tweet, what they're talking about, well, let me ask you, Mr. Goldman, you hadn't had a chance at all. This tweet, is that referring to a personal political issue of President Trump or official U.S. policy?
That's a personal political issue. And if you don't mind, I'll just take a moment to respond to Mr. Castor, because
please do.
On that July 19th meeting between Ambassador Volker and Rudy Giuliani, Ambassador Volker told Mr. Giuliani that the allegations about Joe Biden were completely bogus and wrong. And Mr. Giuliani actually told, according to Ambassador Volker's testimony, Mr. Giuliani said that he knew that. And yet, for the next 2 months, he continued to push for that same investigation at the direction of President Trump, who had also directed President Zelensky to contact Mr. Giuliani. So that July 19th meeting that Mr. Castor brought up is actually quite important to this investigation.
And sir, you already explained that on May 23rd, when the official folks who went to the inauguration of President Zelensky came back to tell the president how impressed they were, the only thing he had to say to them was, talk to Rudy. He was taking his official government people responsible for Ukraine and handing them over to Rudy Giuliani so that they could work with him for the issues that he was focused on for the president, as evidenced in the tweet. Is that fair?
I agree with Mr. Castor. I think that's what the evidence shows, that at that May 23rd meeting, President Trump directed and delegated authority over Ukraine matters to Ambassador Sondland, Volker, and Secretary Perry, and told them to work with Rudy. And then over the next 3 months, that's exactly what happened at the president's direction.
Okay, and in fact, let me show you what is slide 22, if I may, that you understood the Ukrainians recognized how important Rudy Giuliani was and satisfying him in order to stay on good terms with President Trump?
Yes, they quickly realized it, I think, from their own internal conversations, because Mr. Giuliani had back channels to getting to the Ukrainian officials. And Ambassador Volker told the Ukrainians as well that there was this, quote, Giuliani factor that President Zelensky, he actually told it to President Zelensky, that there was this Giuliani factor that they needed to deal with the president.
And in fact, this is the senior aide to President Zelensky saying to Ambassador Volker on August 13th, which is obviously after the July 25th call, thank you for meeting in your clear and very logical position. It will be great meet with you before my departure and discuss. I feel that the key for many things is Rudy, and I'm ready to talk to him with him at any point. Please let me know when you can meet. Audrey. And again, that's Rudy, am I right? That's the Ukrainians recognize that Rudy Giuliani, who's demanding the investigation of Mr. Trump's political rival, was key to getting anything done.
I don't mean to be a stickler, but I believe this text was actually July 10th. And this was a critical text because what it is saying is Mr. Yermak, after having spoken to Mr. Volker a week before and learning about the importance of Giuliani, requested to Ambassador Volker to set up a meeting with Mr. Giuliani. That then proceeded to this July 19th breakfast that Mr. Castor said, and then a July 22nd phone call, and then ultimately they met in Madrid on August 2nd.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. Further evidence of the meticulous investigation that Chairman Schiff and his staff with you directed. We will stand corrected. Thank you. And I will take that and ask that the record reflect that is the correct date. In either case, Rudy was key whenever it was said, correct?
Certainly.
And now let me ask, sir, let me put up slide 24. And Mr. Goldman, am I correct that there came a point in time when President Trump, through his chief of staff, Mr. Mulvaney, ordered that the approved military aid to Ukraine be withheld, as you previously indicated, correct?
Yes.
And this is the testimony of the people who were involved. Mr. Kent said when this happened, there was great confusion among the rest of us because we didn't understand why that had happened. Since there was unanimity that this aid was in our national interest, it just surprised us all. Mr. Holmes, and then you had the additional hold of the security assistance with no explanation whatsoever, and we still have an explanation, and we still don't have an explanation for why that happened or in the way that happened. Ms. Croft, the only reason given was that the order came at the direction of the president. So, sir, let me ask you a question. Did all the agencies involved believe that the aid should be given?
Yes, it was the unanimous view of all of the agencies, Secretary of State, Department of State, Department of Defense, National Security Council, literally every one of the interagency agencies that believed that the aid was vital and had already been approved and should be released immediately.
And in the minority staff report and in Mr. Castor's testimony earlier, he said the U.S. government did not convey the pause to the Ukrainians. Well, that wasn't correct, was it? Didn't Mr. Sondland convey that, according to Mr. Sondland's affidavit and testimony?
Mr. Sondland ultimately conveyed that the release of the aid was conditioned on the public announcement of the investigations.
And if we could put up slide 26 from the affidavit.
Presume that, though, is what he said.
Well, if I may, just in response
We'll put up the slide.
Sure.
We could put up the actual affidavit that Mr. Ambassador Sondland, the President Trump's ambassador to the European Union, that he swore to under penalties of perjury. And he says, if we could read the highlighted, which is also in front of you, I now recall speaking individually with Mr. Yermak, where I said to Mr. Yermak, the Ukrainian aid, that, going back to the quote, that resumption of U.S. aid would likely not occur until Ukraine provided the public anti-corruption statement that we have been discussing for many weeks. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, he said that at a meeting on September 1st with Mr. Yermak in Warsaw.
And the statement that they had been talking about, let me put up a slide that we put together, slide 27. And do you recall, sir, that in the draft statement that the Ukrainians were going to have President Zelensky give so they could, and was that statement on their mind so they could get a White House meeting and satisfy President Trump and have the aid released?
Yes, Ambassador Sondland testified to that, and Ambassador Volker also testified to that.
And am I correct that Mr. Yermak gave a statement where he did not make any reference to Vice President Biden, correct?
Correct.
And then was that Rudy Giuliani who said in the second one that it had to include a reference that they were going to investigate Burisma in the 2016 election?
That's right.
And what did Burisma stand for? Did all your witnesses say they had an understanding of what that meant? Or did the witnesses say that?
So every single witness said, after reading the phone call on July 25th, that it was clear Burisma equaled Biden, that they were one and the same. There were only 2 witnesses who said that they did not know that until that time. And there was ample testimony. There was a lot of testimony from people involved in all aspects of Ukraine policy who indicated that it was completely unrealistic and unlikely that anyone who had anything to do with Ukraine would not know that the Burisma investigation related to the Bidens.
And is that why, and that's how Mr. Giuliani publicly referred to it often, as Burisma and Vice President Biden, correct?
Correct, yes.
And did the Ukrainians complain repeatedly, we talked a little bit about it, that they didn't want to be a pawn in U.S. democratic politics by helping President Trump's reelection campaign by making such a statement?
They said that in July, and in August, ultimately, they didn't give the statement in large part because they had reservations, given that President Zelensky was an anti-corruption reformer. They had reservations about engaging in U.S. domestic politics. That's right.
Okay. I want to go back to you, Mr. Castor. You said that when President Trump said to Ambassador Sondland on September 17th that he had no quid pro quo, you said he had no reason.
September 9th.
September 9th. You said he had no reason to be any less than candid. That's what you said. No reason to be any less than candid. Let me show you, sir, what happened, though, on September 5th. Let me show you slide 52. Days before he made that statement, the Washington Post printed an article that says Trump tries to force Ukraine to meddle in the 2020 elections, and goes on to describe some of those efforts. And, sir, let me show you whether President Trump was aware of that article before he volunteered no quid pro quo as a defense. Let me show you a tweet by President Trump on slide 53. Now, and again, he is putting out a tweet that is essentially saying the Democrats, based on following up the article, that they are pursuing impeachment. Again, showing awareness that this has now been reported on. So, Mr. Goldman, is it fair to say what Mr. Castor said, that President Trump had no reason to be any less than candid about saying no quid pro quo?
No, I think President Trump had every reason to try to put out that message at that point. As Ambassador Sondland said, even if you credit Ambassador Sondland's version of the testimony, which is contradicted by other witnesses who took contemporaneous notes and were far more credible than Mr. Sondland, who had to amend his testimony a couple times, he said even in that comment, he said no quid pro quo out of the blue without any question about whether or not there was a quid pro quo.
Gentleman's time has expired.